Chapter 17, The Awakening. For all the hesitation and pause that Brock may have felt in the past, replacing Lemmy turned out to be surprisingly easy. Nik had already suggested Paul Rudolph, a veteran of the Pink Fairies and, therefore, all those old Pink Wind shows, pointing out that he knew the material, he knew the ethos, and, as Nik says, Paul was more of a musician than anybody else in the band. A lot more versatile and a lot more capable. Newly arrived back in London, Doug Smith found himself charged with hunting down Rudolph, agreeing terms, booking flights, and getting him airborne in time for the next show. A lead guitarist, Rudolph would take over Brock's traditional role in the band, while Brock himself would play bass. Had it only been possible, he would already have been in Toronto before Lemmy even arrived there. Only problems booking his flight allowed Lemmy the dignity of that final concert. And Lemmy himself? He was stunned, and he was remorseful. But he couldn't see the reason for it because he was always right. Later, conspiracy theories arose, as of course they always do. Nik later heard that Brock had been talking about sacking Lemmy 6 months earlier, and even before that, if the German incident was anything to go by. Brock, on the other hand, floated the frankly absurd suggestion that he'd heard that Nik had threatened to leave the band if Lemmy wasn't dismissed. Doug Smith, meanwhile, simply put his head in his hands and declared it the most ill-considered idea the band had ever had, and took solace only from his belief that it would be a temporary separation. It wasn't. A new project suggested itself. The Chilean director Alejandro Jodorowsky had recently optioned the film rights to Frank Herbert's Dune, and during one of Nik's visits to Paris to see his old friend Philippe, the suggestion that Nik might soundtrack the movie was never far away. I was staying with Philippe and we went to the Café Ball, which has all these paintings by French Impressionists on the walls. It was a really cool place, in the left bank, the Bohemian area. And Philippe told me about Jodorowsky, who I think was a friend of his. He knew about the film, he got me to say I'd do some music for it. But I don't know what happened, it didn't really get that far. I didn't write anything, we were just talking, oh you could do some music for it. But then I didn't hear anything more about it. Indeed, the entire project eventually fizzled, largely over financial issues, although Jodorowsky's projected script, demanding a 14-hour movie to realize, may also have been instrumental, and Nik's attention returned to Hawkwind. The American tour over, Hawkwind returned to the UK to face a British press that could not get enough of the story, and audiences that were frankly appalled that such a readily identifiable member of the classic Hawkwind lineup had been so peremptorily ejected. Lemmy was not the only person, after all, who later claimed he'd been sacked because he was busted with the wrong drugs. Nevertheless, the band was firing on all cylinders and, with Warrior on the edge of time now hot on the shelves, they hit the British road. The Hawkwind live show was now built almost entirely around the new set and stage show, a blinding extravaganza that made its greatest impact, strangely, when the band played that least hospitable of outdoor venues, the Reading Festival in August. Hawkwind were headlining the Friday night, yes, and Wishbone Ash took top honors over the next 2 days, on a bill which also included Dr. Feelgood, UFO, Kokomo, Wally, Joan Armatrading, and all the way down at the bottom, Judas Priest. And while it was Yes who grasped most of the following week's headlines, by virtue of a performance that only just fell short of throwing in the kitchen sink, Hawkwind's set closing with a truly mind-charring salvo of Master of the Universe, Welcome to the Future, Brainstorm and Silver Machine surely deserved the silver medal. Bob Calvert, who had just completed his second album, Lucky Leaf, and The Long Ships with Nik, Simon House, Paul Rudolph and Mike Moorcock all on board, plus producer Brain Eno, came along for the ride, and ended up taking the stage as well, while longtime fans had another reason to remember the occasion. Stacia was about to get married, Reading was her final performance with the band. Taking place across the same weekend as the Reading Festival, the Watchfield Free Festival was Hawkwind's next stop, the following evening. Staged at a disused military airfield near Shrivenham, Watchfield was regarded as the successor to the People's Free Festivals that had hitherto been held, and attended by Hawkwind, in Windsor Great Park, although on this occasion for the first time it took place with government sanction. The previous year's Windsor show had ended in a near-pitched battle as the police threw themselves into the hippies, and the ensuing public outcry apparently embarrassed the government in general, and Home Secretary Roy Jenkins in particular, into action. Perhaps inevitably, the fact that the festival was official put a lot of people's backs up, the very people, in fact, who should have been grateful. Indeed, organizers Bill Dwyer and Sid Rall found themselves being jailed for contempt when they pushed ahead with plans to hold a Windsor feast at the same time as Watchfield. But while no more than a dozen or so people, plus 350 police, turned at Windsor, Watchfield attracted several thousand, there to be entertained by Vivian Stanshall, Arthur Brown, the 101 ERS, featuring a distinctly pre-Clash Joe Strummer, Stray, Gong, the Global Village Trucking Company, and a slimmed-down, but still dynamic quartet of Nick, Brock, Powell, and Rudolph. Hawkwind's performance had more in common with a guerrilla raid than an actual concert, the quartet pulling up, setting up and playing before many people even realized what was happening. And so a partial strength band largely jammed, turning in a set that touched occasionally upon moments of the new album, but otherwise had far more in common with the band's beginnings, riffing familiar sequences that drifted liquid into breathtaking improvisation. And, surveying the crowd and the campsite that seemed to stretch back for miles, it felt to Nick as though Hawkwind were on the threshold of a whole new beginning. Fresh management was in place. Tony Howard, whose wizard artists also looked after T-Rex, were introduced to the band by Nick, following a break with Doug Smith. They had a new record label, Charisma, one of the figureheads of the early 1970s prog movement, was still reeling from Peter Gabriel's departure from their #1 nest egg, Genesis, and label head Tony Stratton Smith agreed that Hawkwind's recruitment was at least partly rooted in the label's need to pick up another chart regular to replace the fallen heroes. "I always liked the people at UA," says Nick. "Andrew Lauder was a very nice chap, I always got on with him, and because they ran Blue Note, he used to give me all the new albums. Plus, the head of the record company, Martin Davis, also came from Margate, so we were able to talk about our home turf, and I got on very well with him. But when we went to Charisma, there was Gail Carlson, who was in charge of A&R, and the company was run by Tony Stratton Smith, who really was one of the great characters in British rock, who only ever signed acts that he really believed in, and they were very much more into being personally involved with the band. So it was a good move for us, and it allowed us to start thinking about a fresh direction. A new road crew crystallized around road manager Jeff Dexter, and Calvert agreed to return to Hawkwind full-time as the band's sole lead vocalist. However, the initial impetus behind the reunion was swiftly to fall away. I've just finished writing a scenario for a stage show which is based on Dan Dare, the Eagle comic character. I wrote a script for the whole thing. Everyone was behind it, it was just a matter of trying everything up, legally. Unfortunately, someone else stepped in with an offer for the Dan Dare rights, bought them up and left me high and dry. Him and Hawkwind alike. Had the stage show gone ahead, that would have been the band's next project. But time spent together planning Dan Dare was not wasted. A new dancer, Ricky Howard, came aboard, and in February 1976, with Nick, Calvert and Barney Bubbles, reinstated after the misadventures of the last LP, conspiring an overall concept, Hawkwind went into Roundhouse Studios in Chalk Farm to begin work on what would become Astounding Sounds, Amazing Music. The new album, All Three Decreed, would take the band far from the pastures they had plowed in the past, away from space travel, superheroes, swords, and sorcery. The songs looked back on the pulp magazines of the 1950s, the primarily American experience that conjoined outlandish concepts with even more outlandish experimentalism to birth, ultimately, what became the comic book explosion of the 60s. Two songs, the Calvert Brock co-writes Reefer Madness and Steppenwolf wrote the concept Large and Loud, the former themed around the classic anti-drug movie The latter modeled on the Hermann Hesse tale of the same name, and standing proud as the bridge between classic and new style Hawkwind. Against a grindingly glacial guitar riff, Calvert's personification of the werewolf is almost chilling in its attention to detail and, across its full 10-minute length, utterly spellbinding in its claustrophobia. Calvert had already recorded Steppenwolf once, as a guest appearance on Adrian Wagner's first solo album. There, however, it was fraught and tentative. Here, it blazed with malevolence, even as Calvert confessed Steppenwolf was a borrowed figure from the only Hermann Hesse book I can actually stand. I think Steppenwolf is a great book and Harry Haller is a fascinating character. He's not really a hero by any means, although he's sort of the last of the great romantic heroes, a solitary figure who stays in his room writing poetry and letters in a smoking jacket. The hero figure is something I am fascinated in, mostly in sending up. I didn't really take it very seriously. It's not a case of wanting to be the hero. I wanted to be laughed at. I wanted to be funny, although Steppenwolf I think a lot of people took as being more sinister. I must confess I didn't really see anything funny in it myself. That was one of the more serious pieces, but the rest of it was meant to be quite comic. I think there was an element of tongue-in-cheek in Steppenwolf. It was defiantly over the top. The melodrama elements were not spared in it. I was really trying to do two things. If you take two almost opposite things and mix them together in the right proportions, you get an effect which is quite resonant. The idea was to have the werewolf films combined with Hesse's man-wolf with a big distinction. Anyone who missed the joke, meanwhile, could lose themselves instead in a sleeve design based wholeheartedly on the kind of advertisements that were often as much a part of the pulp experience as the stories themselves: wonder cures, X-ray spectacles, hypnotism and the ubiquitous Charles Atlas. Each band member was co-opted into endorsing a different product: Monsieur Nik's French lingerie company, Dr. Brock's atomic pile remover, and so on. There was just one cloud on the horizon. Dr. Brock himself really didn't like the album. With his hitherto iron grip on the band's songwriter snatched away by the fact that everyone in the band appeared to have something new to offer, he appeared almost a passenger on the finished record. He would receive co-credits on just 4 tracks. Nick, what was interesting about Astounding Sounds was, Dave's on it a bit, but everybody else was on it a bit as well. I think all of the band's members were trying to be as creative as possible really. A situation where everybody had a chance to actually write something and was encouraged to. Which had not happened before. I mean, I was always trying to instigate that, but it didn't really happen. It was much more of a communal effort than any past Hawkwind album. Everybody had a song on it. Simon House wrote City of Lagoons, Paul wrote The Aubergine That Are Rangoon, Alan Powell wrote Chronoglide Skyway, whose innate funkiness sowed the seeds of his departure, after he suggested all Hawkwind tracks should be so danceable. There was very much some involvement from everybody in the band. Previous albums had been predominantly written by Dave, mostly his compositions, either co-writes with Robert or songs he wrote himself. He composed a lot of solo material. I was allowed 1 or 2, but he always said other people just didn't seem to have any ideas, which is something I've also seen in other bands. People are told their songs are rubbish, and if they hear it enough, they start to believe it. People say there's one control freak in every band, and it's perfectly true. On Astounding Sounds, he got shouted down. Robert was very strong on the album, while I had an idea for a song, Caduflyer, which came from an article I read about a guy who wanted to fly a glider off the top of Mount Everest, and which Robert and Simon put together with Jamie Mendekow. I think the album was a very interesting one, because people were optimistic about their own creative abilities and were allowed to express themselves. I honestly don't know how it was that Dave allowed it in a band that he was trying to run. Maybe that's why I got the sack, because perhaps I was too loud in encouraging people to do stuff. Certainly Brock has made no secret subsequently of his disappointment with the album, dismissing it as being too funky, too jazzy and, most of all, too boring. In fact, it was probably Hawkwind's most diverse and dynamic album yet, and March 1976 saw Hawkwind set out on tour, introducing the new material from within the dynamic confines of their most spectacular stage set yet, the glowing molecules and gaudy quarks of Atomhinge. Critically, it all amounted one of the strongest moves that Hawkwind had ever made. Hitherto disinterested journalists acknowledged their conversion to the cause. Reviews pointed ears that had lost faith after Silver Machine back in the direction of the mothership. Calvert's new stageware, described by the NME as an S&M cross between Biggles and Lawrence of Arabia, won applause from all corners. Nik's adoption of World War I style aviator goggles went down so well that Brock picked up a pair as well. A new single, mixed by Pink Floyd's Dave Gilmour, arrived in the summer and, though Curb Crawler added just one more flop to the band's post-urban guerrilla catalog of disappointments, it increased interest in the album regardless, at the same time as the album after that began taking shape. Calvert had already resurrected his early 1970s Spirit of the Age verse, composed additional lyrics, then passed them over to Brock to soundtrack. Back on the Streets, already being touted as the band's next single, was in the live set. Opa Loca was morphing into Uncle Sam's on Mars, Time for Sale and Hassan I Sabah, responding to the mid-1970s oil crisis by recasting the Sheiks as jihadists, had fallen into place. All pointed toward a vibrant future, one that would coalesce around Hawkwind's awareness, and acknowledgement, of the punk rock movement that was still no more than an underground ripple at that time, but which would explode out of all proportion before the year was out. For the first time in almost a decade, since the days of Hawkwind's own underground, musical currents were stirring in a subculture that polite society was scarcely even aware existed, the world of youth unemployment, barely habitable housing, poverty, repression, and rage. True, many of punk's primal progenitors were later revealed to have come from altogether more salubrious backgrounds, but their conviction was genuine, and their anger was certainly honest. Nik was especially intrigued, and for precisely those reasons, the sense that, for the first time since the dawn of the decade, a musical force was growing that owed nothing to the demands of the music industry, was, if anything, resolutely opposed to all that the industry could demand. No matter that the first bands were signing to major labels, the Sex Pistols to EMI, the Clash to CBS, the Stranglers to UA. Hawkwind signed with Liberty before they were even 6 months old. Malcolm McLaren, the Pistols' manager, and owner of the sex boutique where various Hawkwinders frequently shopped, was a longtime friend of Nik's, and had already made a point of introducing him to the Pistols after their first gig at the Marquee, where they just trashed Eddie and the Hot Rods gear. Now, reading the press, catching the bands, Nik saw punk as the logical offspring of all that Hawkwind had laid in the past. Meeting the musicians, including the Pistols' Johnny Rotten, he learned that Hawkwind had, in fact, been a major part of their musical adolescence. Nik laughs, although Johnny Rotten publicly sort of disclaimed anybody with long hair, he was actually secretly known to have been a roadie for Hawkwind at one point. Unbeknown to Hawkwind too. Ha-ha-ha-ha. It was only later when he was famous that he mentioned that he had roadied. I think he mentioned it to Bob Calvert once. The Damned were emerging, with guitarist Brian James a dyed-in-the-wool Pink Fairies fan. The Maniacs, comprising a couple of Cambridge lads, Alan Leeshaw and Rod Latter, who not only played in an early 1970 band with Twink, ZZZ, but would reunite with him in 1977 as The Rings. Larry Wallace, another fairy, was signing to Stiff Records as both a recording artist and in-house producer, and summer 1977 would see him in the UK Top 20 as overseer of the advert smash Gary Gilmore's Eyes. Calvert was adamant. There's a punk connection. If you listen to Born to Go Now, it sounds like a punk band. It could be the Buzzcocks, or someone like that. Indeed, Pete Shelley actually confessed to us that he'd spent a lot of his early youth listening to albums like The Space Ritual and derived quite a lot of his musical direction from it. Which doesn't surprise me, but this is something which never gets mentioned in the press. Maybe it wasn't 1971 to 1972 all over again. But it was close, and Hawkwind themselves were closer to those ideals, too, than they had been in a long while. Paul Rudolph had slipped effortlessly into the lineup, a superior guitar player to Brock. Even Brock admitted that, who shared with Nik the crucial notion that a band should be something more than a simple machine for making money. It should also be in the business of making a difference. There was just one weak link, and ironically it was the least malleable one of them all. Nik had never understood why, at almost every stage of Hawkwind's existence, there had to be one band member who was unhappy with the way things stood, but there was, and this time, it was Brock. Chaffing at Paul Rudolph's subpoenaing of his traditional berth as the band's lead guitarist, dismayed, too, by the ease with which Nik and Calvert had fashioned one of Hawkwind's best ever received album without any real input from their principal songwriter, Brock's paranoia reached its apex when he heard, allegedly from Calvert, that his neck was the next on the chopping block, that Nik intended sacking him from what he still viewed as his own band, with Rudolph and Alan Powell backing him up. Confronted with the accusation, Nik was if anything even more surprised than Brock had been when he heard the story. There was no conspiracy with Rudolph, Powell, or anybody else to sack Dave Brock. Later, maybe, he wished there had been, wished that he had acted on the thoughts and suspicions that had swirled through his mind for the past 6 years. But he also knew that to do so would have been so far out of character that he could never have lived with himself afterwards. Manipulation has never been a quality he admires in anybody, least of all in a bandmate. Others, however, were less picky. A band meeting was convened at Tony Howard's office, and Nik was not invited. The first he heard about it was when he was told by Rudolph and King that if he didn't leave the band, they would. Brock kept quiet throughout, let it be known that he was simply bowing to the will of the majority. But Nik never doubted that he both instigated and engineered the entire situation, with the connivance of a manager who had already proven that when it came to handling bands, he was only interested in the player he regarded as the leader of the group. Everybody else, and he had already demonstrated this with his handling of Mark Bolan's T-Rex, was just a hireling, there to play the music and pick up a paycheck. Howard saw Brock as the person he could deal with, realized that they spoke the same language. The language of business. The rest of the band were expendable, beginning but certainly not ending with Nik. By the time of Hawkwind's next album, Paul Rudolph and Alan Powell, too, would be out. Within a year of that, Brock and Calvert alone remained in the band, and had changed its name to the Hawklords. And Nik, who never saw any of it coming, ultimately decided that everything had worked out for the best, for him, for the band, and most of all, for the ideals that he had always espoused, and which he was now again free to pursue. Most of the time when this subject comes up, emphasis is put on the fact that Alan Powell and Paul Rudolph wanted to get rid of me, but as far as I'm concerned it couldn't have happened without the quiet consent of Dave, who has always and at all times wanted to be in control of things within the band. But the gang up theory is fine when it comes to saving face. Nik was stunned and disgusted. Right at the beginning of the band, I was involved with Dave. I used to sleep on the floor in his kitchen, and we were very good friends at the time. We didn't have any problems. Even now, I look back on things that happened in Hawkwind, and it's only with hindsight that I see a lot of what must have been happening. Anyway, I was told the band are going into the studio the next week to record a single, Back on the Streets, and they didn't want me in there. It was Calvert's apparent compliance with the move that shocked Nik the most. He numbered the singer among his oldest friends in the world, without even considering the number of times he'd been there when Calvert needed him. Nik believed the last decade and more of friendship ought to have counted for something. And maybe it did. Calvert at least seems quickly to have regretted the decision to oust his old pal, and just a few days after their final show together, at Lewisham Odeon on December 19th, Nik was offered an olive branch in the form of a return to the lineup, no questions asked and, presumably, no answers given. Nik shook his head. I was offered to be reinstated as a member. A secret deal. But I turned it down. It was not merely time to start a new chapter. It was time to begin a new book.